And we're going into 2 weeks where it's absolutely critical that you examine all the information, not just what is relegated for you to see. I'd like to follow up with my vlog from a few weeks ago regarding COVID-19, because now is a seminal point. The overarching fear being injected into the news media, public policy, and social media really concern me because they play into our fear of the unknown. And this reminds me of the opening words of President Franklin Roosevelt's inaugural address. They are, "So, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance." Now, ironically, these were the words spoken at the height of the Great Depression. And as the U.S. enters its version of the COVID-19 pandemic, we need to be mindful of these words so we can convert retreat into an advancement. So while there's a lot of good news happening, which I'm going to get into in a minute, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. It's going to get ugly over the next 10 to 14 days. And the news is going to be focused on this. And it's going to keep you locked down in fear because people are dying and are going to die. And this is especially true if you reside in an area that's affected, like the greater New York City area or the northeastern corridor currently. Or similarly, if you or someone you know is hospitalized with COVID-19. This brings things home, and at this point the numbers simply don't matter. And I'm saying this because I don't want to trivialize the suffering and death of these individuals, their families and loved ones who do wind up with a case of COVID-19 and it lands them in the hospital facing permanent damage or even death. It's not trivial. But yet, amidst the fear-driven cacophony of bad news, each new day also brings advances to gain that upper hand on COVID-19. And it's critical you recognize these advances because in the heat of battle, and we're heading into that, it's really difficult to see this. And we're going into 2 weeks where it's absolutely critical that you examine all the information, not just what is relegated for you to see. So what makes COVID-19 lethal is not that it is particularly lethal in the way that, say, Ebola or anthrax are lethal, meaning that if you get Ebola or anthrax, you're probably going to die. That's what they have us thinking. But that it's particularly has this transmissibility and infection rate that is exponentially higher than SARS, influenza, or the common cold viruses. In other words, what makes COVID-19 lethal is that it comes down to a numbers game. COVID-19 can infect exponentially more people. So just say, for example, in a normal influenza season, you get 20 million people infected and 15,000 die. Instead, COVID-19 left unchecked, which is not the case, will infect, say, 200 million and 150,000 die. So shall I dare say that COVID-19 is the most scalable coronavirus? I mean, heck, if this were monetizable business proposal, venture capitalists would be lining up to woo it with funding instead of what they're doing, which is cloistering themselves away in their vacation homes, scared to death of coronavirus. Seriously, it is very real. It's this very real capacity to touch billions of lives that is the reason that we are in self-containment, whether global, local, or on an individual level. So now, with each passing day, we have a better understanding of the nature of this virus. Let's look at this. It doesn't like the heat. Like most organisms, UV light kills it quickly. sunlight and warm to hot, dry air, the outer environment, just stop its transmissibility dead in its tracks. And this is what explains the low transmission rates in places like Southern California, the Great Basin, and Desert Southwest. Now, by contrast, overcast, cold, wet climates and dense population centers tend to be much more at risk. So there's a big difference in where it's at. It's not a blanket thing. Okay, so another thing, COVID-19 appears to be particularly aggressive and difficult to treat when the infected individual has cardiopulmonary challenges and for those who are immunocompromised. That's what we're starting to see. Another thing is smokers are particularly vulnerable group, principally due to what they're finding is the overexpression of the ACE2 enzyme caused by smoking. And this is probably the primary reason for the data showing that men are more prone to serious outcomes than women. Now, why is this? Well, the initial data so far is out of places like Italy, Asia, and Spain, where culturally smoking is really prevalent in the male population and not in the female population. Now, similarly, vaping would make those individuals, young people, particularly vulnerable to the outcome of COVID-19. Now, several epidemiologists who made worst case scenarios weeks ago when not much data was available and they were just going off their numbers have revised their numbers and viewpoint in recent days as the hard data starts to come in. Okay? So the take home from the emerging reality of COVID-19 is this. If you are an active and healthy individual with no underlying conditions, COVID-19 is far from lethal. Get that. Because the emerging data suggests that 20 to 30% of those exposed will either not get the virus or get infected and be asymptomatic, completely asymptomatic, which makes them contagious, which is really a problem with this thing. 56% of the population who gets exposed will get symptoms ranging from a mild cold to a severe flu, but not to get them in the hospital. And the remaining 14% who get exposed will wind up in the hospital requiring, medical interventions. And overwhelmingly, these individuals aren't so fit and have underlying conditions. Now, there's a much larger segment of the population who fall outside of those exposed to and infected with COVID-19. And this number nobody can quantify, we just don't know. However, as the real data projections are being revised, it's suggesting that this outside demographic represents the majority of people in the U.S. rather than the minority. And it also suggests that our collective actions to limit contact are actually working. Okay, the immune system of a relatively healthy person infected with COVID-19 will beat this virus. Understand that. Just like it does with other coronaviruses, and thus it'll confer immunity. This means that that infected person, once they're through that, can no longer infect others, nor can others reinfect that person. And this can occur in as little as 2 to 3 days or as long as 2 to 3 weeks, which means let's use the 3-week mark. And it also appears that the global death rate is waning, it's getting down, and that the recovery rate is actually growing and has surpassed 200,000 and is hovering around 20% of the documented cases. So that's good news. Now, we also need to look at Japan, Taiwan, and Singapore, who moved quickly and succeeded in beating COVID-19. Even South Korea was able to go over it, and China, the source of the outbreak, appears to be over COVID-19 for the most part. We're not hearing enough about these advancements, and we really need to, because they worked. And they worked in time spans of weeks, not months, as predicted by the Western prognosticators. So really important you pay attention to that. Though the U.S. was late getting started, the measures taken 2-3 weeks ago to limit contact are starting to show signs they're working. Even with the large increases in testing, the rate of growth of new cases has sharply decreased of late, and this downward trend will continue over the next 2 weeks in all but the most affected areas. Even the Seattle area has witnessed their numbers drop. Be sure to keep this in mind over the next 2 weeks, as the news will be deteriorating in places like the Northeast, where things are going to get interesting before they get better. So while we are adding total confirmed cases, the rate is far below the projected doubling of every 3 days, 3 to 4 days. And this has actually caused several experts to revise their projections lower. And this is that from what they originally did, which sparked the pandemic that sparked the toilet paper pandemonium. Bear in mind that the testing is also limited to people who are symptomatic or people who have been in known contact with confirmed cases. Okay, so let's go back to Franklin Roosevelt's speech because it is relevant now as it was then. How do we convert retreat into advance? All of the suggestive strategies I discussed in my first video on COVID-19 are still valid. Okay? Social distancing and isolation still rule the day for another week or two, particularly with people who you don't know or have traveled to places that have a high infection rate. So stay away from that. But this being said, if you live in an area not hit by COVID-19, which is most of the U.S., your life should start to return to some level of normalcy, but avoid contact outside your immediate family. I mean, maintain best practices of hygiene without going OCD. And keep in mind that heat kills this thing. So saunas, hot drinks, inhale hot air into your nostrils, get out in the sun. Okay? Continue and train to maximize your cardiovascular potential. This is the way nature intended. And finally, think of this as an opportunity to become a much stronger and more resilient version of yourself. If anything, COVID-19 demonstrates the need for adaptation. It's the cycle of life, and we've forgotten this. We are so preoccupied with getting ahead financially, material, and conveniently. Our bodies have retreated to becoming vulnerable to what should be a non-lethal virus. So we want to advance first and foremost, and this is what it'll do. So I hope that this video has reaffirmed what I've been saying, not to get caught up in the panicdemic, to stop, think, use the emerging information to your advantage so that you can navigate this thing in a way that makes sense and continue on that health journey, continue on that cycle of life, because viruses adapt, mutate, and advance to survive, but part of that cycle is we advance and get stronger so that we can survive something like COVID-19. It's really about that. And that's the underlying question, because in the end, this shouldn't be killing us if we're as healthy and robust as the evolutionary pressures that shaped us. So thanks again for listening, and I hope this helps you continue on that journey of optimizing your health and performance potential. Thank you.